Hi, everybody. This is Nelson with Creekwood.aquatics, and this is Aquarist Assembled. Aquarist Assembled is brought to you by Creekwood.aquatics, a better class in nutrition. If you want to find out more about Creekwood.aquatics, we're a small aquaculture company based out of Floresville, Texas, where we produce live foods and we sell tropical fish. You can always check us out at Creekwood.aquatics.com. You can follow us on all social media. This week's going to be a little bit different. I'm currently traveling. I packed up all my recording equipment besides the charger for my laptop, so I'm filming this from my phone, so things are a little clunky. But one thing I do want to talk about today is lowering your phosphates and your nitrates in your aquarium. Lately, I've been going on forums and I've been seeing this question kind of pop up. Um, People are asking, how do I lower my nitrates and phosphates in my aquarium? And I thought it would be a real interesting topic to cover. But before we start, it's important to remember that every aquarium is an individual. And what works for you might not necessarily work for someone else. I like to believe that there's hundreds of ways to run the aquarium, and finding a system or technique that works for you is going to be based on you, your aquarium, your comfort level, and your skill level. The first thing you want to talk about when you're discussing lowering your nitrates and phosphates is your husbandry. The most important thing you can do to lower these things are water changes and good aquarium husbandry. Um, a lot of people have different techniques for this. They either do daily, they do weekly, or they do monthly water changes. I'm more of a monthly water change type of guy, or my freshwater systems whenever I get around to it. um, but yeah, husbandry, very important. Next thing you want to think about is how much food are you feeding your aquariums? And is all that food actually getting eaten? Or is it just sitting on the floor, decomposing? Is it falling behind your rocks or ornaments? Where it's no use to anybody besides the bacteria that's living in your aquarium? The next thing you want to talk about is if it's a marine system, your protein skimmers. Um, how do you have your protein skimmers set up? When people talk about their protein skimmers, they either talk about a wet foam or a dry foam. What does that even mean? Well, we're talking about the amount of water in your final product, your skimmate or your protein. I like to run a wetter foam. And what that means for me is that my foam has a higher volume of water in it and it has organic materials from the aquarium. But that water is going to be kind of like light brown, kind of like a tea. It's just going to look like water that has a bunch of tannins in it. I like to run my aquariums that way because I feel like the skimmer's constantly working and is constantly pushing those things out there, overflowing into the collection cup. Then at the end of the day or every 2 days, I can always just grab the collection cup, pop it off, pour it down the drain. There's some people that like to run a dryer foam. That means, again, less water volume in that protein. But their skimmate, their protein waste kind of looks like a thick sludge, and there's always like a nice little crust ring at the bottom. Um, Again, it's whatever you're comfortable with. It's whatever works for you. Again, there's 100 ways to do this. But an issue that I ran into recently was we were working on an aquarium and the protein skimmer, you know, the controller said it was on. We saw it move in the water, but it just wasn't producing a ton of foam. And no matter how we adjusted the water flow, the foam just kind of seemed very weak. And we're having trouble figuring it out. So, first thing you do, take apart your protein skimmer. We pulled the motor off. We pulled the little cap where the venturi connects to. We looked in there and we saw a ton of hair algae just wrapped up in the impeller. They have little needle wheels. So just imagine like a flat disc that has a bunch of little pegs. And those pegs are meant to chop up the air bubbles so you can make a nice fine foam that those little bubbles, that surface tension collects all the organic materials in your aquarium and then flows up into the collection cup. I know, a bunch of nerd stuff I just said. Whew. But we found out that all this hair algae actually clogged up that needle wheel, so it wasn't pulling water in as efficiently as it needed to. So we took the needle wheel out, we scrubbed it with a little toothbrush, we made sure that all the hair algae was removed, we reconnected it, turned it back on, and bam, we were producing a ton of foam. The other thing that I do, a lot of people don't do this necessarily, I just picked this up from one of the older aquariums that I used to work with, where we had this giant venturi. But we always wanted to make sure that the venturi was clear because it's constantly pulling, atmospheric air through it. So we were worried about dust, debris, worried about salt crystals that might have formed in the venturi. So we always just ran a little bit of warm water through there just to break up all that debris and keep the venturi running nice and smooth. So we just talked about aquarium husbandry, your water changes. We talked about your protein skimming. The other thing we can talk about are medias for phosphate removals. There's a bunch of medias you can get right off the shelf. I listed a few right here that I'm trying to pull up. But some of the medias that we used to use were things like Phosban, Phossorb. There's GFO, which is just a generic term for granular ferric oxide. I know one of the brands was Roa Phos or something like that. But granular ferric oxide is exactly what it sounds like. It's just rust. It's just rust powder. It's really tricky to work with sometimes for beginners. They don't realize that they have to rinse it off before they use it. And when you rinse off your GFO, always use your RODI water. It doesn't really make sense to me. This is what I was taught, to take your GFO and to just run it over with tap water, because the tap water has a bunch of phosphates, has some nitrates, and it's going to start absorbing that stuff out of the tap, and it's going to be less effective when you put it in your aquarium. When you run these types of loose materials, they're best ran in some type of reactor. So they sell little systems. I like this, and just an example. But yeah, it's a little system. You put your media in there, and there's little pumps on the outside, and they push water and they force water through that media and then back into your aquarium. Those are the most effective ways to run this stuff, like GFO. Some people like to put it in a bag and they throw it in their sump, but then it turns into like a little basically hard rock by the end of the month. So it's good to put it in a reactor that's going to keep it tumbling, that's going to keep it moving, but not so violently that it grinds itself into a fine powder and then it starts spewing that out into your aquarium, because that's going to cause a bunch of other issues. Now, and there's also small little bags of ChemiPure Elite. Those were some of our little favorite little things to just put into people's aquariums, because again, they have carbon, they have GFO, they have other types of resins that absorb all the little nitrates and phosphates and all that other stuff. But ChemiPure Elite was a really cool little bag, and you just chucked it in there and just called it a day. But then we have my favorite type of phosphate removal, and it's carbon dosing. And a lot of people hear carbon dosing and they don't exactly know what it is. Carbon dosing is you're dosing anything into your aquarium that has carbon in it. And that could be anything. It could be sugar, it could be vinegar, it could be vodka. Those are all examples of carbon sources. And people hear vodka and they're like, you're crazy. But believe it or not, the vodka, again, it has its carbon and it has the most potential energy out of those other things that I named. There's other aquarium products that you can get off the shelf, and here's a few of them that I remember. But there was Nopox by Red Sea. There's Vibrant, and there was Reef Biofuel, and that one is used in conjunction with another bacteria called Microbacter 7. And they kind of worked hand in hand. So the reef biofuel is the energy source, the carbon source for the Microbacter 7, and that bacteria, that that carbon source kind of like turbocharges them. So it gives them the energy, and they start going around and start eating nitrates and phosphates, and they get nice and fat, and then they make their way through your filtration. They end up in your protein skimmer, and they get skimmed out of the water. They get pulled out of solution. They end up in the collection cup. You can just take that cup and you can pour it down the drain, and you just remove nitrates and phosphates from your system. But my most favorite, and I'm being 100% honest, are biopellets. Biopellets are basically a carbon source that's in a pelletized form. It's usually made by some type of corn or vegetable oil, and you put that in a reactor the same way you put your GFO or your granulated carbon and all that other stuff. But these little balls will sit in this reactor, and they'll kind of tumble, and the water will flow through them. Eventually, bacteria starts to grow over that surface area. They get a nice little biofilm on them, and the bacteria is trying to eat and dissolve those biopellets. You'll see those biopellets getting smaller as time goes by, but they're utilizing that carbon again for energy. They're absorbing all the nitrate and phosphate that's around them. Once they get nice and fat, they actually just slough off of the biomedia. They get picked up by the protein skimmer. They end up in the collection cup, and you can just pick them up and pour them straight out. It's the coolest thing. Just one thing to know about the biopellet reactors is that they do take time for you to see results. So don't set up a biopellet reactor and expect that it's going to work the first day, the first week, or even the first month. Like, it's going to take time for that media to get coated with the right type of bacteria, and for it to coat the rest of your surface area in your aquarium, and for it to do its job. But it's one of those things that if you keep up on it, you keep the biopellet reactor topped off. Whenever it starts to get a little low, just add more pellets in there. You will notice results. I dealt with a tank. It was one of our bigger reef tanks, and it was algae wall to wall. And we did the ROAFOS, we did the GFOs, we did all these things. We did water changes, reduced feedings. We did all that stuff, and it just felt like a losing battle because the algae would start to kind of die down, and then it would just come back. We even tried the RX Flux, fluconazole. It was like an antifungal thing that people put in their reef tanks because it has like an anti-algae effect. And we did that, and that worked for a little bit. All that algae kind of died down, but then it came back because what we were realizing is, yeah, we were killing that current algae, but they were releasing that nutrients back into the water without doing those big water changes, without having an effective protein skimmer. I dealt with issues where people weren't changing their filter socks too often. So those filter socks are just holding on to all that organic debris, and that's just getting re-released back into your aquarium. Change your socks often. That's what I'm trying to say. But yeah, the biopellet reactors, I think, start them. They're really cool. They take time, but you will see results. Start testing your water within the first month or two. You'll start noticing your nitrates are coming down. The phosphates go down. Like, our phosphates got pretty close to zero, and we noticed a huge reduction in that algae. The last thing that I want to talk about are macroalgae. So things like Cato, things like Caulerpa, they're great. I started to shy away from them, especially the Caulerpa, because if the Caulerpa ends up in your main exhibit, it starts to grow everywhere. It's uncontrollable, and it just becomes its own issue. I like the Cato because it's more slow growing. You put that in your sump. You put a nice little red LED light above it, and it does a great job at absorbing nitrates and phosphates, and it will just continue to grow. It also becomes a great refuge for things like copepods and arthropods and all those little small little critters that live in the reef tank. And then this is the coolest thing about it. So you put in this small chunk of Kato, it starts to grow. You want to reduce your nitrates and phosphates. Just grab that Kato, break it in half, throw that half away, put this half back in your aquarium, have it grow. And again, as it's growing, it's absorbing all those nutrients. The only thing is that they absorb a little bit more than just the nitrates and phosphates. So they are going to absorb other trace elements in your aquarium. So that's one thing you got to watch out for. So if you have Kato, just make sure that you're dosing and you're doing your water changes and you're adding all those elements back into your aquarium. Anyway, that is what I have for reducing nitrates and phosphates in your aquarium. Another topic that I want to cover at another time are fish well-being or animal well-being in your aquariums. It's something that came up. It's something that we've been doing at my job for years. And recently, when I went to one of the pet shops in the area here, that was a big thing that they were talking about, and they were going to start adding into their little system. They were going to start doing animal well-being, and I was like, you know what? That's a really cool topic. I almost want to talk about it right now, but that'll be another episode. But anyway, this is Nelson with forgot the name of my show again. This is Nelson with Aquarist Assembled. It's been great talking with you guys. Have a great night.